Another edition of Village in Motion. I'm very excited to be your host once again, Diane Gatsis, Havinga. We have a wonderful show for this Monday, July 23rd. And it's kind of like a part two of our conversation we had a few weeks ago, Ek Music, who is our guest here, because a couple of weeks ago we talked about the War of 1812. We talked about the fact that it was kind of that forgotten war. Was very short in comparison to the war we're having right now.
Right, very much so.
But that was the war, you said, Ek, that really established the United States.
Right. It really it sort of consolidated everyone, and what was interesting that we never during the war we never really had any continuous battles. It was one battle here, one battle there, and one battle there. And today you're going to talk a little bit about, not a little bit, about how the Star-Spangled Banner came about. And that really occurred during the Battle of Baltimore. Now the British had just defeated Napoleon, and so they had more troops available and what have you. And so from the garrison in Bermuda, they sent a guy by the name of General Ross. He was sent to Baltimore, and his instructions were to wipe out, to win, get back the city of Baltimore. He arrived, and they had, actually before that, he was at Bladensburg. He won at Bladensburg, and he was the one that went into Washington, D.C., burnt the Capitol, and last time, as you know, we talked about our president's wife taking
right, Dolly
out the
Madison.
Yeah, wonderful.
Right.
Wonderful story.
So that story,
anyway,
the burning of Washington and Dolly Madison saving the portrait of George Washington, plus the Star-Spangled Banner being written, were really the two stories that people most likely remember.
Exactly. And it culminated, of course, at the Battle of Baltimore, when Ross then went to Baltimore, and he was a very capable general. And at the first assault on Baltimore, he was killed by two young Maryland guys. Well, there were two named, but one of them actually did the killing. Two 18 and 19-year-old kids shot Ross, which historians say arguably that was a little turning point, because the guy that was second in charge, a Colonel Dwyer, I believe, he wasn't as effective. Anyway, they then began the assault on Fort McHenry. And I think now we've got a video, I think.
Well, do we want to hear the Star-Spangled Banner first before we hear the history? I think we should do that. We have a lot of Star-Spangled Banner renditions today, but here's one that we chose because it's probably the one that when people think of the Star-Spangled Banner, they think of something really patriotic and uplifting. So we're going to show you one rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner right now. You know, with the Summer Olympics just a few days away, I have a feeling we may be hearing that more than once. I believe it's the London Orchestra who did all the national anthems.
I hope so.
But at any rate, getting back to, so there's the Star Spangled Banner. Let's talk about how it actually came to be.
Well, there was a fellow by the name of Francis Scott Key, and who was a lawyer and actually an amateur poet. And he was the one that wrote a poem that was later converted into the song of the Star Spangled Banner. The tune actually came from another song, a British drinking song, as I recall. That was
just a little irony on that part. Then.
But Diane, I think if we can go to the video, and that'll hit some of the high
right.
spots of that.
So here's a history, kind of in about 7 minutes or so, of the Star Spangled Banner. And when we're done with that, we'll come back and talk some more.
The War of 1812 is sometimes called the Second American Revolution because it was fought over promises made but not kept by the British at the end of the Revolutionary War. It was an especially vicious war. By August of 1814, the British had entered Washington, D.C., routed the American troops, they'd chased President and Mrs. Madison from the city, and then they burned down the government buildings, including the White House and the U.S. Capitol building, the very symbolic center of the American nation. The British then headed for Baltimore, at that time the nation's third largest population center, to attack Fort McHenry, which was located on a peninsula guarding the city. That fort had been named for James McHenry, a military officer under Generals Washington and Lafayette during the Revolution. McHenry later became a signer of the U.S. Constitution and then the Secretary of War for Presidents George Washington and John Adams. The British understood that the destruction of Fort McHenry would be another demoralizing defeat for the Americans. Now, Major George Armistead, the commander of Fort McHenry, had arrived at his post a year earlier. He understood that at some point in the war, because of the strategic importance of that fort, that he would probably be attacked by the British. So in June of 1813, he had commissioned Mary Pickersgill, a widow who made flags for ships, to make 2 flags for the fort. The smaller flag, which was still a very large 25 feet long and 17 feet wide, was called a storm flag, to be flown in inclement weather. The larger flag, which was the garrison flag, was an impressive 42 feet long and 30 feet wide. Armistead had wanted that flag to be so large that it would be impossible for the British to miss it from a distance. He didn't want them to lose their way and miss the fort. So when the British approached a year later, in September of 1814, they first attempted to take the fort by land, but that assault was resoundingly repulsed by the tenacious Americans. 16 British warships then positioned themselves in the harbor around the exposed fort to begin a devastating bombardment and force its surrender. However, at the same time that military preparations were being made for this massive assault, a relatively small and otherwise insignificant humanitarian effort was simultaneously underway. As the British had marched from Washington, through Maryland, and on toward the fort, they had seized leading citizens along the way and carried them off as hostages, placing them as prisoners on board British warships. One of those hostages was a Dr. William Beans. Some of Beans' many friends prevailed on a young Baltimore attorney and on John C. Skinner, the U.S. government liaison agent, to approach the British and plead for Beans' freedom. The 2 men successfully negotiated his release, but since the British were about to launch their attack on the fort, all 3 were detained and placed on board a British ship to be released at the end of the battle. Early in the morning of September the 12th, 1814, the British launched their attack. It was raining and wet, so the Americans were flying the smaller storm flag. The British, with their superior weaponry, placed their ships outside the range of the American guns, and then they launched a high-trajectory projectile attack against the fort, hurling thousands of cannonballs and scores of rockets down upon the Americans in an unrelenting hail of fire and hot shrapnel. Throughout that full day, during that night, and across the next day, the bombardment continued as Dr. Beans and his two friends watched helplessly. After dark, on the evening of the second day, the firing finally ceased. The silence was deafening, and the suspense was agonizing. Beans and his friends couldn't tell if the firing had stopped because the fort had fallen or because the British had given up. Rising well before dawn on the morning of the 14th, the three Americans pressed tightly against the railing of the ship, straining eagerly to see any indication of what might have befallen the fort. When they had last seen the fort the night before as darkness fell, the American flag had still been flying. But was it still flying? The young Baltimore attorney held a telescope tight against his eye, searching to see whether the American flag still flew or whether a British flag was now flying in its place. As he waited, he pulled a letter from his pocket and on the back of that envelope began to scribble an inspired poem voicing his thoughts about what he was experiencing at that very moment. He began that poem with a simple question that had tormented his own soul as he peered through the early morning darkness. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilights, at last night's last gleaming? Could anyone tell what had happened? Did anyone know the outcome? He soon saw the answer for himself. The fort had not surrendered. In fact, the Americans had taken down the smaller storm flag and raised the massive garrison flag, and it now waved proudly in the morning light atop the 90-foot flagpole, while the Americans inside the fort played Yankee Doodle and fired their guns in celebration. The Americans had taken the worst the British could give and had not been defeated. Just 3 months later, the British signed a peace treaty to end that war. But on that momentous morning, after the flag was seen waving in the breeze, the three Americans were finally released from the British ship. And on their way back to shore, Francis Scott Key continued to ponder what he had just experienced. Later, in his hotel room, he completed the poem, penning 4 full verses, the last of which summarized what patriotic Americans so strongly felt. Praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust. His poem was soon printed, and it was sung, ironically, to the melody of a popular British tune. Known as the Star-Spangled Banner, by the 1890s the military required that it be played at the raising and lowering of the flag. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson ordered it played at all military ceremonies, and on March 3, 1931, President Herbert Hoover signed a federal law making the Star-Spangled Banner America's official national anthem. And today, that song and its words remain no less stirring to Americans than when it was first penned some 2 centuries ago.
We kind of saw a capsule of the history of the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner and how it became our national anthem. Any other thoughts you want to add to that?
Well, there are various versions. Yeah, there are actually some interesting things that came up. I need to refer to my notes here a little bit, but our audience here, which is mostly people my age and around there, they probably know of a famous conductor by the name of Walter Damrosch. And I remember as a kid, when my mother, we played on the radio, we'd always hear Walter Damrosch on Saturdays at the operas and at the symphonies. But anyway, Wilson in the earliest 20th century, actually in 1917, he had the Bureau of Education look at the various forms of the national anthem and decide how it would be done. The Bureau of Education appointed 5 conductors. Walter Damrosch was one of them. They came up and they examined the song and they looked at it and they each evaluated, and then I quote here, an official written version of the final votes of the 5 men have been found, and it showed all 5 men's votes tallied Measure by Measure. Now, these are well-known conductors and everything. They went over it anyway. They decided this was the way the national anthem should be.
So they're the ones
played.
that made it almost unsingable for us, our lay people.
That is a good observation because that's very, very true. Now Puccini used part of the national anthem in Madame Butterfly, which I also found rather interesting. But Diane, if we have enough time, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the other commemorative stuff. It's interesting here in Washington, D.C., we have a site at 601 Pennsylvania Avenue where a commemorative site where the Star-Spangled Banner was first publicly sung. Now, what I found interesting here was that it was in a hotel, Brown's Marble Hotel, where Lincoln had stayed previously. It's at the corner of 6th and Penn Avenue. And what's very interesting, it was sung in a restaurant or a bar, which is sort of, in my view, sort of nice. But the restaurant and bar was owned and operated by free black. Operated the bar from the Civil War. That he was a free black and he operated that bar. So it's I thought it was a nice story that he was able to.
So we heard on the history that it really wasn't until Herbert Hoover who actually made this our national anthem. So did people just start on their own singing it and adapting it, or
some of it, Diane, some of it was helped by the Navy early on declared that this was one of their official songs, although of course it wasn't the official Star-Spangled Banner, the national song. But we started playing it at ball games. I think it was the 1918 World Series. It was first played before a ball game. And thereafter, it's as you know, we play it at I think at all sporting events now. That the Star-Spangled Banner.
Even the minor leagues play the Star-Spangled Banner,
which is
in
very nice.
The high school competitions and so on and so forth.
Now there was actually a law passed by the Congress that said when the Star-Spangled Banner is played, the statute actually tells you what you should do as far as putting the hand over the heart and how you should, your movements. So when you hear, according to when you hear the Star-Spangled Banner played, if you're walking to a ball game, you're supposed to stop and stand, rigidly at attention.
I do think most people do that.
Well,
now that I think about it, I haven't been to a ball game in a while, but
I haven't. Although I must say, at some of the Redskin games I used to go to, I used to get a little disgusted with people. Some of them would keep their hat on, and some would just stand there and keep talking. But I remember going to football games back when I was in college, and we'd be there early, and we had a good view of the field where people would march up. And when they heard the Star-Spangled, everybody would stop, cars, everything. Which I don't know if that still happened. Maybe I'm being a little overcritical here. But anyway, do we have time for a couple more things? Okay,
of course.
There are a number of plaques and sites that honor Francis Scott Key. Now, maybe a lot of people here. We have the Key Bridge. And that's actually named after Francis Scott Key. I don't know if some of our newcomers
That's the bridge from Virginia into D.C., Georgetown,
into Georgetown, yeah. Now, there's a Francis Scott Key Park located at 34th and M Street in Washington, D.C. Let me see. In Baltimore, they have a plaque by the United Methodist Church in Vernon Place in Baltimore, and that was put up in 1912 and commemorating Francis Scott Key's death. He died at his daughter's house of Pleurisy at age 64. And I think there's one other here I wanted to mention. Yeah, the memorial to Francis Scott Key is in Frederick, Maryland, is where he's buried. And it has I don't know if we can we can't get a shot of this, but it's a granite pedestal engraved with the song itself, and he's buried there with with his wife. So and there are numerous other memoirs throughout the country.
Well, and you can go to
him.
Fort McHenry, which I have gone a couple times, and they actually do a flag ceremony if you're there late enough in the afternoon, where they take down the flag, and it's a huge flag. I think it's the same size as the original, if I'm not mistaken, and they do a flag ceremony at the end of the day. You can, of course, tour the fort. And then at the Smithsonian, of course, downtown, is the flag that is displayed. And I'm sure most of us remember going to the American History Museum, and one of the things when you entered the building was the flag on that big wall, draped down. Well, that is no longer the case. They have it now under, they've restored the flag, and they have it under a glass enclosed temperature, whatever, because it's starting to deteriorate. But the flag,
tremendous size.
It's a huge flag. And the flag itself, though, after the war, one of the things that I thought was quite interesting is that they started giving away pieces of the flag.
You're kidding.
So,
really?
because the people who
pieces of the original
flag, the people who owned the flag was the woman who actually sold the flag, her family. And so the family kept the flag for many years. I would say, I might even say 100 years.
This was a gal in Baltimore, right?
Right, this is the Baltimore woman. The family kept the flag, and they would unveil it at certain times in the history, and then certain people, they would give little snippets of that flag. And then finally, the family donated it to the, I don't know if it was the Smithsonian or the government, and then the Smithsonian took it over.
Did they actually sell these little snippets? Or?
I don't know if they sold it or just gave it away to certain people.
That's amazing. I hadn't heard that. Yeah, that's a little tidbit. If you're standing somewhere and you run out of conversation, you might say, "Hey, by the way."
But what I also found interesting about the Star-Spangled Banner is that over the course of the time it was our national anthem, there has been some controversy in terms of whether or not it should be our national anthem, basically because it is so very hard to sing for most common people, and to even remember the verses. So some of the other songs that have been in competition has been God Bless America and America the Beautiful.
Right.
But so far, the Star-Spangled Banner has won out.
And we're going to, at the end of the program, we're going to have some versions of people that didn't think it was too difficult to sing, right?
Right, and some do a better job than others.
Right. Yeah, we'll see.
But what should our audience remember about the Star-Spangled Banner?
Well, I think the main thing is how it came about. You know, that he was when he stood on the deck of that ship, and his whole body had to be stirred by, hey, we did it. We did it. We've won this battle, because, you know, again, going back to the whole War of 1812, it wasn't all that great for us, and he had to feel that. I said, my God, and that's what inspired him. I think it's really a beautiful story when you think about it. When he saw that flag still waving up there, and he was able to compose that poem and then put it. Of course, he didn't put the music; someone else did. But and we really, again, this is arguably with historians, but we, as far as I'm concerned, we became a nation after the Battle of Baltimore and all that. It put us together, and because we still had some of the states that were very, you know, they weren't all that keen of being part of a union as such. They all had their own little things that they wanted to do, but this sort of, again, brought us together, and it showed the world that we were a nation, and of course since then the British have been a close friend and ally of us. So.
And again, this war took place only 20 years after the Declaration of Independence. Yeah. So we were still kind of a nation of tittering on whether or
Right.
not we would
Very-
succeed.
Very much so.
In
very much
so this was this the third time that the British, I mean, because we had the Indian War that
We
was
had the
also
Indian War.
with the British.
Well, and the last battle with them, of course, was at the Battle of New Orleans, and that was actually fought after the truce was signed. But the war established us as far as going west. To many people, to our disgrace at times, we defeated the Indians, though, and they were no longer a viable force as far as stopping the expansion to the west, and that really the war opened up the whole country.
So before we let you go, we do have that little compilation of various singers and artists performing the Star Spangled Banner. So we're going to play that in a moment. If you have not gone to either Fort McHenry, it's not that far away. It's about an hour drive from here. It's definitely well worth it. It would be a great little day trip with your grandkids to go out and see that, especially if you go towards the end of the day. And of course, if you haven't seen the actual Star Spangled Banner flag, I mean, that's right. You should go down and see it. It's over at the American History Museum.
And Diane, I would also say, I hope none of our viewers' feelings are ruffled by it, because what they're going to hear and see is a little different. So and Diane and I debated about whether we'd end the program that way, but we thought this would be rather.
Show that video we've been talking about, and sit back and enjoy it. It's a great little video.
Exactly.
Oh, say, can you see the dawn's at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous light, o'er the ramparts we watched, was so gallantly streaming, and the rocket red glare, the bombs bursting in air, that our flag was still there.
If anybody, I would ask you, because you're younger.
I know most of them.
Oh,
Let's
do
put it
you?
that
Really?
way. Okay. But I think you get an idea of how hard it is, not only
Right.
to sing it, but to remember the lyrics.
That's a good point.
At the recent golf, was it the U.S. Open?
Yeah.
They had. We didn't put this in that video, but the singer had it written on his hand, the lyrics, so
Yeah.
he wouldn't forget it. So but gee, I'd be right there with them, I think.
Oh, no, that's great, Diane.
So thank you, Eck. This has
Thank
been
you.
really a great time to sit back and learn about the history of the Star Spangled Banner.
Yes.
It is its bicentennial, 200 years. Could you believe that? It's
I don't, no.
pretty
Okay.
amazing feat. So thank you, Eck.
Thank you.
And I want to, before we leave,